Hello, I'm Carwyn Jones, and welcome to this series of podcasts where I'll be interviewing the movers and shakers in the Welsh economy. What's their journey? What are they doing now? And how do they see the future, not just for themselves, but also for Wales? I'm delighted today to be joined by Kellie Beirne, who is the Chief Executive of the Cardiff Capital Region City Deal. Kellie, you're very welcome indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Kellie, we know what you're doing now. Tell us about where it all started. Where are you from?
Well, I'm from Newport, and I'm very proud to be from Newport. It's in my blood. I'm incredibly passionate about the city. And I went to a school on the east side of Newport, Hartridge Comprehensive. It was fairly notorious when I went there, it has to be said. But I learned such a lot at that school. It wasn't always the easiest, and in fact, I think I chose some of my A-level subjects according to who I thought might be present. But it taught me a lot about life, you know. It instilled some real early lessons and things that I'll never forget. So incredibly passionate about Newport, and I've always remained that way. When I left university, I went to Cardiff University after leaving comprehensive school. I then got on the graduate training programme for Marks and Spencer, and they converted my placement to Canada for me. So I was able to live in Vancouver for a few years after university. And again, that really opened my eyes to some very different perspectives, particularly around enterprise and entrepreneurship and a can-do attitude. And I think when I came home to Wales after that brief interlude of a couple of years, I was really motivated, I think, to try and not just make a difference, but make a difference in quite an enterprising and a resourceful way. So for me, it's always been about, I think my background has always been about combining that passion for social mission and purpose with a really enterprising entrepreneurial spirit. And I think some of my background has probably instilled that in me.
And you went into the housing sector.
I did. Yeah. So I returned from Vancouver, and I was always fascinated by housing and different tenures and the impact that the housing I saw around me had on people's life chances. I always felt quite deeply about homelessness, and, you know, it was something that always bothered me. And when I saw an advert one day for a trainee housing manager with Newport Council, everything seemed to come together. It was my home city. It was something that I felt that I could really learn and progress in. And I was really keen to apply for that job.
So housing sector is what interested you at that point. And you mentioned that you spent time there. And then housing association.
Yeah, I mean, I worked for Newport Council for a number of years. And I did some funny jobs. You know, I cleaned toilets in a homeless hostel. I worked with homeless families. I would hit the streets at night counting rough sleepers. And I think that really motivated me. And I remember speaking to a young man one night. He was asleep in Newport Station, and he was incredibly young. I think he was only 17. And he was from North Wales, and he was telling me why he was sleeping that night in the station. He couldn't be at home. His background was incredibly chaotic. You know, he hadn't had a bath in weeks. In fact, he could, you know, you saw visible body lice on him. And I think that really motivated me to want to stay in that sector and to think about how, you know, whatever position I did, or, you know, whatever I was fortunate enough to do, could I relate it back to having an impact on that young man? So that has kind of been a barometer for me in the housing sector and beyond.
You went then to Monmouthshire?
I did, yeah.
Went north?
Yeah.
And you were the Director of Innovation and Enterprise and Chief Officer, Regeneration and Culture. Something new, obviously not something that was directly connected with housing. Well, a bit, I suppose, but tangentially. But enterprise and culture, a new field for you then.
Yeah, I really loved my time at Monmouthshire. It's a very unique place. The culture of that council, I'm probably biased, but, you know, I think that culture allows people to work optimally. And I did lots of different roles in Monmouthshire. I did enterprise, I did the Deputy Chief Executive role before I left. And I was fortunate to have that breadth of different experience. Yes, housing was always part of it, but I began to see other ways to make a difference back to that young person I spoke about. So I think what I learned from my time about in Monmouthshire really is that culture is what we grow people in. You know, anything is possible if people are given their wings, you know, if they feel that they have your back in, if they feel they don't need to check in every 5 minutes for permission, if they know that sometimes in the pursuit of having a go, you're going to fail. And, you know, provided somebody's got your back, that's okay. That really gives that liberation and freedom. And I think in Monmouthshire, we were able to be really experimental in terms of new ways of working and thinking less about funding cuts and how we manage that, and thinking more about how we imagined a very different future for that county. So it was a really exhilarating but very important time for me, I think.
You mentioned the young man who you met, and you mentioned that this job that you had in Monmouthshire was another way of being able to help people like him. What did that mean practically? What were you able to do?
Well, I think, so I've always been somebody who has loads of ideas. Sometimes I want to tell my brain to be quiet because I'm always thinking about, I could do this or we could try that. So I've always been experimental. You know, I think it's in me. My father's really entrepreneurial, and I think it just must have bit me at some stage. So things that we did in Monmouthshire around sort of changing the operating model. We worked quite closely with Nesta around their Creative Councils programme. I mean, one of the things that I was really proud to have started before I left was a project around tackling rural loneliness and isolation, not through the conventional means, but thinking differently about behavioural change and what we could inspire in our communities to think differently about how we care for those around us. So I think for me, it's always been this natural inclination towards social justice, but how do we scale our impact and what we're able to do from having a really commercial mindset? And I know some people sometimes say, well, those things are mutually exclusive, you know, thinking about social justice and then thinking about sort of competitiveness and the economy and capitalism. But I think they're absolutely perfect bedfellows.
You touched on an issue there that I think is going to grow in society as a challenge, and that's loneliness. Not just perhaps in rural areas, but urban areas as well. And we see fewer families living close to each other than we used to. Is that something you've seen growing as a problem over the years?
I think so, yeah. I think, some of these things sometimes sort of escape our notice, but, you know, they probably are some of the big societal challenges that we're going to have to face up to. And I think in my role now, I have the privilege of not just thinking about how we tackle big economic challenges, but how we tackle some of those community societal ones as well. So I think the thing about the work that we've done under the GovTech project with Monmouthshire is about, so immediately we thought the problem was public transport. We haven't got enough public transport in rural areas. Let's put more buses on. But when you really scrape back and you understand what the challenge really, really was, buses and transport may be one of the solutions, but actually it was that connection, that community spirit. People sometimes were living in rural areas with neighbours around them and still feeling quite disconnected because they'd lost a loved one, or maybe the library service didn't call, or Meals on Wheels, perhaps wasn't, the thing that it once was. So things are changing. And I think with a focus on mental health, social media, some of the pressure that I see my own kids under, you can be in the biggest, most populous, vibrant, buzzing place, and you can feel more lonely than ever. And I think that is something really that, we have to consider and think about.
Used to say, didn't they, probably still do, that London was one of the loneliest places to be if you didn't know anyone.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really fortunate. I live in a village and we have to be quite connected. We're not cut off, but I think, that breeds a resourcefulness around, right, who takes the kids to school? Can we support the local dairy? And I know it sounds a bit motherhood and apple pie, but it does make you think differently about sustainability. And I think in thinking differently and in thinking about your personal contribution to how we solve problems, there's something scalable in that. And I think if we get it right, it could be potentially really special.
So we come to 2018 and you become the chief exec of the title right, Cardiff Capital Region City Deal.
It's a bit of a long...
Obviously something very topical, something that a lot of businesses are very excited about in terms of what it might be able to deliver. Before we go on to what's happening on the ground, how do you see the city deal developing over the years? What would you, if I asked you to name 3 things you'd like to achieve in that time, what would they be?
Well, the first thing, and probably the most important thing, is I see the city deal as more than just a city deal. I think it's about building a fundamentally different future for the Cardiff capital region. So it's a catalyst, really. So I always say we've got a £5.3 billion city deal because we've got to leverage £4 billion, but only £1.3 billion is coming from government sources, and what a fantastic challenge. Secondly, I think, in light of what's likely to come, we're going to be a very, very different space. So I think we've got to think much more competitively in our future. All new future monies for regional economic development will come through the UK Government Industrial Strategy and what Welsh Government has, and we're going to have to be competitive to be able to access that in the future. So what I'd really like to see is to think much more about resilience and sustainability, not grants and handouts, but investment and hands up, and how we can really go out there and stand by our competitive strengths. And I think that the third thing really is to think much more about inclusive economies and what that means in the Cardiff capital region. I think in the past we've sometimes thought about agglomeration economics, and if we just focus on our big places and our cities and we grow them, everybody feels the benefits. But we're quite small in the Cardiff capital region, and I think there's a growing body of evidence that says, we really have to intervene in a more judicious and wider sense. And if we're going to get that inclusive impact, if we're going to make an impact in places like Blaenau Gwent, which is still at the very bottom of the UK competitiveness index, we have to do something differently. So I think for me, it's a combination of seeing it as a catalyst, thinking about competition and how we can put ourselves out there, but at the same time balancing that with thinking about the social justice issues. The economy is important. It pays for public services, and we've got to think about that intersect, I think, and how we can really get in that space and optimise and, be bold and be quite ambitious about what we stand for.
You mentioned with Blaenau Gwent there that there needs to be a different approach. What would that approach look like for you?
Well, I've mentioned sort of some of the historic issues that we've had, if you think about the cessation of European funds now, and we've got to think more globally, we've got to put ourselves out there. I think one of the things that I'm quite keen to do in the Cardiff capital region is to really understand our core competitive strengths. Sometimes, we've got a propensity to do lots of things, and I think having that focus is going to be incredibly different and difficult at the same time. But there are some connectivity issues that we've got to be able to tackle. And that isn't just about moving people around, it's about bringing people together. I think we've got to think about skills and some of the people issues quite differently. What kind of future are we preparing people for? I think as well, something that's really important is thinking about how we build clusters and ecosystems of our business strengths. And really, where can some of those businesses go to? Do they all have to be around cities? How can we spread those and get a more distributed effect based on local supply chains and how we get those supplier effects and lock in the value of public procurement? So rather than just localising our spend, thinking about how we can put things like open data out there and get people to solve our problems with us and have that spirit of social innovation. So I think through a combination of those things, and it'll take a lot more, I'm sure, but we can start to sort of move the dial.
You mentioned skills there. One of the things I found over the years is that potential investors would have that as their first or second question.
Absolutely.
Have you got the skills pipeline? That'll mean we'll be able to get the people we need to be successful. And they will go to where they think that skills pipeline will be. The other alternative is to compete purely on cheap wages. Well, of course, that was done in the late 80s and early 90s. That ship has sailed, and we don't want to be on it.
No, we don't.
So now it is down to skills. What can you offer us? Not so much in terms of what money you can throw at us, because that's not the determining factor. It's can we survive, prosper in your part of the world.
Yeah, and I think that is the core question. Whichever business or investor I speak to, it's always about the nature of our skilled workforce. They want ideas, they want access to capital and infrastructure, but have you got the right people with the right skill set? And we've got a really high proportion of graduates in the Cardiff capital region, one of the highest proportions in the UK. But then there's a gap then in terms of the lower skilled workforce. So I think it is something that is incredibly hard, and I don't think there are any silver bullets. I think we've got to think much more about intelligent labour markets, how they work. Data sharing is incredibly difficult. Sometimes the cycles of investment for skills are annualised, which doesn't always allow for long-term planning. When I talk to my daughter and her friends, they want portfolio careers. They don't just want one job. So, we've got to think beyond, some of the singular interventions that we've done in the past, I think, and try new things out, be much more experimental, have that challenge focus. And I think when we are working to improve our workforce and to think about skills and people development, it's getting them to work on real world problems, because that's that inherent transferability, which I think sometimes, we haven't always focused on.
So in terms of how we go about delivering on all these things, give us some flavour of what the City Deal is doing at the moment.
Yeah, first of all, we've spent a bit of time putting the right foundations in place, making sure, we've got data and evidence. I know it sounds a bit trite, but, we've got to make sure that we're operating with really solid foundations. I've worked very closely over the last year with our Regional Economic Growth Partnership and our Regional Cabinet to produce our Industrial Growth Plan. We've converted that into an investment framework, so we've set up an infrastructure fund, an innovation investment fund, and a challenge fund. So innovation and infrastructure, I think, speak for themselves, but a challenge fund is very different. So rather than assuming that, we know all the answers and we've got these prescribed solutions, can we put a load of problems out there and think about how we respond, stimulate new markets, create new products and ideas? Again, it's hard, but I think our regional cabinet have taken a brave approach. They're really thinking about their legacy. And I think as a cabinet now, they've got that strength and maturity, which is incredibly important.
Never say to a politician they're brave. It scares them.
Okay, noted. So in terms of delivery, I mean, that's translated to several things. Obviously, I was very fortunate to be involved in the first project, which was around advanced compound semiconductors, a key industry of the future. We could have the world's first compound semiconductor cluster here in the Cardiff capital region. So we've just put quite a significant business case submission along with Welsh Government and other industry and educational partners into UK government under their Strength in Places Fund, because we need to create these ecosystems. We're doing some work around transport. Our Metro Plus is about sustainable transport schemes that really focus on the future. So electric vehicle development, low emission vehicles, thinking much more about active travel. I'm in the throes of putting together a housing catalyst fund at the moment. Again, not...
What will that do, the Housing Catalyst Fund?
Well, housing... So again, rather than just thinking about doing more of the same, the very clear steer that I've had politically is what is the problem that we are really uniquely placed to solve in terms of the housing market. So we've done quite a detailed piece of research, and the core problem seems to be around former industrial sites that have been sat there for many years, that are vacant at the moment, and mean that sometimes we're developing on greenfield sites because these things are really hard to tackle. They're expensive. There are viability issues. So our fund really seeks to tackle the challenge around bringing some of these former industrial sites vacant as a result of deindustrialisation back into use. So again, that's going to be incredibly hard, but we're not here to do the easy things. We're here to do the right things. And, many, many other things in the pipeline, which is exciting. You
mentioned transport there. It's obviously a hot topic with some of the problems that Transport for Wales faced, trying to deal with some of the old rolling stock that they managed to inherit. The other issue, I suppose, is broadband connectivity. I've used the phrase in the past that broadband in the 21st century is what the railway lines were in the 19th. If you're not connected, then you're basically seen as the back and beyond. Do you feel that we are there or getting there in terms of broadband, or is there more to do?
Oh, there's much more to do. I mean, one of the projects that we're involved with at the moment with Welsh Government is around a 5G blueprint for Wales, and we're talking with both Welsh Government and DCMS about how we might achieve that, along with a number of industrial players. I think the issue for us in terms of connectivity in the region is there's just such a gap between those that have, really great strength and connectivity, and there's fibre in place, and then those that don't. And it doesn't always mean that they're the rural areas or the valley areas. It's a bit of a pepper pot right across the region. What we're trying to do at the moment is to target and encourage the market to come to the right places through incentives, through interventions, through showing them that there's a skilled workforce. Again, my ethos with this city deal is not money out the door, it's money in. We want much more coming in terms of leverage than we're parting with, because, this city deal has to sustain for a long, long time. So it's not something we want to spend down. So in terms of broadband, really, it's understanding, how we can intervene, how we can be much more enabling, how we can incentivise through loan finance, how we can be much more commercial, ensuring that any returns that go back into the pot can be then put into initiatives that enable, scalability and replicability, so we can get the coverage that we need, because I think that's been the issue.
Let's look at the future. What does the future hold for Kellie Beirne?
I don't know. I'm a mum, and that's the most important thing. I've got an 18-year-old that's just off to university, and a 6-year-old who's lovely and bright and sparkly.
18 and 6.
I know, it's quite a difference there. And, I've never thought of my career in terms of what's next, and my sort of going up the ladder. Just, always what's interesting, what appeals to me. Can I make a difference? And again, I know it sounds trite, but you ask any public servant why they're in their job, and I think, most respond that they want to make things better, they want to make a difference. So yeah, I think I'm committed to the public sector. I can't imagine working anywhere else. I love it. Sometimes it can be frustrating, but on the whole, I think it's where I belong. So I definitely like to continue that. I've made several attempts over the last year to start a PhD, but I keep changing my mind on what I'm trying to do. So hopefully at some point that will come into focus. But I think, I'm just incredibly passionate about, people, about, lots of the people that I grew up with that I don't think, recognise this phrase, fulfilling their true potential. And, I think we've got to try different things, We can't sort of keep on doing the same things and expecting different outcomes. I think, there is such a lot of opportunity out there. We've got to be bold and crack on.
Do you spend much of your life planning for the future and knowing where you want to be, at least I did, I know several others did. And then, believe me, when you turn 50, you start thinking, hang on a second, I know I want to go backwards now, not forwards, because I'll be 60 in 8 years, hang on a second, where does that come from? And you start to get a different perspective, I think, in terms of what you want to do. Work-life balance, have you got it right, do you think?
No, definitely not. Have you been speaking to my mother, Carwyn, have you? She ring you beforehand.
I never reveal my sources.
To give me
like
a
journalist.
Time. Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it? And last week it was my mum's birthday, so I said sort of happy birthday on Twitter, and that, I'm thankful to my mum because she's there all the time. She looks after my kids, she helps me with whatever I've got to do. And although, she's usually cross at me and giving out to me because I'm late again and I haven't done this and I've forgotten that, she gets there's a bigger picture, not all kids are as fortunate as our own. And again, it's that ethos of always thinking about the other, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm a martyr or anything, because, clearly not. But, I think that's what motivates us all.
In terms of Wales in the future, obviously you're in a role where delivering to a plan in a set amount of time is obviously crucial. If we were sitting here in 10 years' time, and I were to say to you, how has Wales changed, or how would you want Wales to change over the course of the next decade? What do you think we need to do?
Well, I think, we've got to be careful with that word change, haven't we? I think it's much more about how we evolve and how we adapt. There are new economies, there's new opportunities. Some of those things are going to mean very different futures for people. I mean, automation, the rapid rise of technology, how we're all going to be able to communicate, engage, how things get done, And I think for us, it's just, it's not about how we survive, it's how we thrive in that world. What are we uniquely placed to offer? And I think for the Cardiff capital region and Wales, it's got to be something that feels authentic and right for us. It isn't about me too or trying to be the same as other regions or other places. It's got to be about, what is sustainability? What is resilience? And, like you, I've been very much involved in the Ford Task Force and some of the stuff in Bridgend. And it's that ability to have foresight, I think, and be able to reasonably foresee what's coming and to be quicker at planning for that. So we're not caught short by some of these shocks. So for me, that word, I could sit here and I could talk about growth and I could talk about competitiveness and being the best and being like Silicon Valley. That doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel authentic. what I really strive for and what I hope for is a resilient Wales in every sense of the word.
Does that mean a broader base to the economy? I mean, it's broadened a lot over the past 30 years, no doubt about it. But you're more resilient, I suppose, when you've got a number of different sectors in your economy. So if one struggles, it doesn't affect everybody, or doesn't have the same effect as coal did when that started going in the 80s, and when the jobs were lost in the steel industry at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it's about, yes, I think diversification to a point. But and I don't believe in this adage of picking the winners. I think we've got to tilt the playing field more and think about the things that will really stand the test of time. I've mentioned things like compound semiconductors. If we can be really good at that and we can anchor and ground that and build a skilled workforce around that, then clearly that is something that is an industry of the future. You can see that as enabling technology through many things. We're involved in medtech and diagnosis and devices. Again, that's got a sense of long-term about it. The foundational economy, that's never going to go away. We're always going to need those everyday goods and services. And I think for me, what I try and test and sort of challenge myself on is the linkages between those sectors and clusters. What is the big ecosystem? Because I think the more that we can knit that together, we can develop those intersects, we can develop that in innovation, then we will have that chance of resilience. So I think it probably is fewer things better, but for me it's about how we bring that together, and we've got an understanding of how it all fits. Really complex and really difficult, but we don't like to set ourselves easy challenges, do we?
No, that's the way life is. Certainly the way politics was. Definitely a challenge that you thought was going to be easy to resolve would end up being incredibly complicated. And those that are complicated often resolve themselves, though Brexit is not amongst those challenges.
Well, yeah.
I mean, in terms of the way you see the future, and in terms of the city deal, you mentioned one thing I was going to touch with you on it. You mentioned the way in which the regional cabinet works together.
Yes.
It was a difficult process to get it up and running, but it's good to hear that there's a genuine sense of working together across local authorities to deliver for a region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen that real maturity in recent times. So not just around a city deal, and feeling comfortable about collaboration around the economy, but recently Regional Cabinet has agreed to a framework for a strategic development plan for the whole of the region. So one land use plan that's common to all, that really takes into account, how we will develop our assets, our economy, our environment, how we will think about the resilience dividend in the future. And again, another important and symbolic recent development is around the Valleys Regional Park, and the Deputy Minister working with City Deal to sort of share our governance and that principle of mutual respect and subsidiarity, that we can do this, we can work together in a very different partnership. I think all these things bode really well for what we can achieve in the future. And I know it's that old adage about, the whole being greater than the sum, but I think we're really seeing that come into its own now.
Excellent. Well, Kellie Beirne, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Best of luck.
Thank you.
For the future. And who knows, in 10 years' time, we might be here talking about these things again. But Kellie, it's been great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your time.